started with a text from my buddy Jason. It wasn't out of the ordinary for him to reach out late at night, but something about this one was odd. "Hey, you up? Found something you need to see." The urgency buzzed through the screen. Jason and I weren't the kind of guys who played around with spiritual stuff, but he was always the one with weird ideas. Ghost hunting? Check. Exploring abandoned buildings? Oh yeah, but this time it was different. His message didn't scream thrill-seeking. It screamed desperation. Against my better judgment, I drove over to his place. His house was a rundown two-story tucked into the outskirts of town, barely lit by a flickering porch light. By the time I got there, it was almost midnight, and Jason's silhouette was already at the door, pacing like he was about to jump out of his skin. "What's up, man? You look..." I stopped mid-sentence when I saw the look in his eyes. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for me to follow him inside. His living room was dark, save for the faint glow of candles scattered around the coffee table. And sitting in the middle of it all, an old wooden Ouija board, the kind you see in thrift stores or horror movies, with its faded letters and a polished planchette glinting under the light. "Dude, really?" I sighed. "You're messing with this stuff now?" Jason shook his head. "It's not what you think. I didn't go looking for this. It found me." I laughed nervously. "What does that even mean?" He swallowed hard and sat on the couch, motioning for me to sit across from him. "I was cleaning out my grandma's attic last weekend. Found it in this old box with some of her stuff. I thought it was just junk. But then..." He trailed off, staring at the board like it might jump at him. "But then what?" I pressed, feeling my unease grow. Jason hesitated before pulling out his phone. He scrolled to a video and shoved the screen toward me. "This." I hit play. The video showed Jason sitting at the same coffee table, alone with the board in front of him. He asked the usual questions you'd expect from someone fooling around. "Is anyone there? What's your name?" For a while, nothing happened. But then the planchette began to move. Slowly, deliberately, the letters spelled out MIRROR. The Jason in the video froze, looking around the room. His hand wasn't on the planchette. "Tell me you didn't fake this," I said, my voice trembling. Jason didn't even flinch. "Keep watching." In the video, the planchette moved again. BHINDYOU. Video Jason whipped around, but there was nothing there. Then the camera abruptly shook, the video cutting off with a garbled static noise. I stared at him, my pulse hammering. "You're telling me this actually happened?" Jason nodded. "It's not just the board. Weird stuff's been happening since I brought it home. Knocking on the walls at night. Shadows moving when they shouldn't. I've been hearing my name when no one else is around. Why didn't you just throw it away?" "I tried," he exclaimed, running his hands through his hair. "It showed back up in my house. Twice. Like it's tied to me now." I glanced at the board, its surface seeming darker, heavier than when I'd walked in. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. "I need your help," Jason whispered. "I can't do this alone." Against every fiber of common sense in my body, I found myself nodding. "Fine, let's figure this out." Jason's face lit up with relief, but it was short-lived. The second we sat down at the table, a cold draft swept through the room, snuffing out 2 of the candles. The remaining flames flickered wildly. Jason shot me a nervous glance. "You ready?" "Hell no," I muttered, but it was too late to back out now. Jason and I sat across from each other, the Ouija board resting between us like a forbidden artifact. The air was heavy, almost electric, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift with the candlelight. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason didn't answer, just placed his trembling fingers on the planchette. Reluctantly, I did the same. The wood was cool beneath my fingertips, unervingly smooth. "Okay," Jason said, swallowing hard. "We just ask it something, right?" "Not we," I snapped. "You." He ignored me. "Is anyone here with us?" For a long moment, nothing happened. My eyes darted around the room, every creak of the old house making my heart leap. The planchette remained still, and I started to relax, thinking this was all just Jason's paranoia. Then it moved. It wasn't subtle, like some cheesy movie where you can tell someone's pushing it. It was a deliberate, strong glide to yes. "Did you do that?" I asked, my voice cracking. Jason shook his head violently. "No, I swear." "Okay, fine," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "Ask it something else." Jason's voice wavered as he spoke. "What's your name?" The planchette circled the board, stopping at letters one by one. We both stared as it spelled out, ADAM. "Adam," Jason repeated, his voice shaking. What do you want?" The planchette moved faster now, the scraping sound unnerving in the silence. It spelled, FRE. Jason's eyes locked on mine. "What does that mean?" I shook my head, a pit forming in my stomach. Maybe it's stuck here. Or... A loud bang cut me off, making us both jump. It sounded like something had slammed into the front door. Jason froze. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, the planchette moved again, spelling out another word, WATCH. We both turned toward the living room window. It was pitch black outside, but something felt off. Jason stood up, his movements slow and hesitant, and peeked through the curtain. "What is it?" I whispered, standing behind him. "I don't see anything," he muttered, but his voice was tight. "It's probably just a raccoon or..." He stopped mid-sentence, his body stiffening. "What?" I pressed, my pulse racing. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and yanked me back toward the table. "We have to keep going," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Keep going? Jason, are you insane? If we stop now, it'll only get worse," he hissed. I didn't know what he meant by that, but the look in his eyes told me I didn't want to find out. Reluctantly, I sat back down, my hands trembling as they hovered over the planchette. Jason asked the next question, his voice barely audible. "Adam, are you alone?" The planchette didn't hesitate. It shot across the board, stopping at NO. My throat tightened. If he's not alone, then who else? Another loud bang came from upstairs. We both stared at the ceiling, the sound reverberating through the house. It wasn't just a noise, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps. "They're here," Jason whispered. I whipped my head toward him. "What the hell do you mean, they're here?" Jason's face was pale as he stared at the board. The planchette moved again, spelling out a single word, DOOR. Before I could process what that meant, the front door creaked open. Neither of us had touched it. The front door opened with a slow, agonizing creak, as if daring us to look. The candles flickered violently, the flames almost snuffing out. Jason and I froze, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but my legs felt like they were filled with cement. "Did you lock the door?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jason's face was ghostly pale. "Of course I did." The door stopped, yawning open just wide enough to reveal the pitch-black void beyond it. Nothing moved outside. No wind, no shadows, just an unsettling, hollow stillness. "Close it," I hissed. Jason shook his head. "You close it." But before either of us could make a move, the planchette jerked violently beneath our fingers, making us both jump. It was like it had a mind of its own now, dragging our hands as it spelled out, HLPME. "Help you," Jason stammered, staring at the board. "How?" The planchette didn't answer. Instead, the footsteps upstairs started again, this time faster, heavier. Something or someone was moving toward the staircase. I stood up so fast the chair toppled over. "We need to leave. Now." Jason grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight. "We can't. Don't you get it? It's already inside." That was when we heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but not from any animal I'd ever heard. It came from upstairs, echoing through the house. Then, a new noise joined it. Whispering. Hundreds of voices, overlapping and indecipherable, whispering all at once. It was coming from the open door. Jason and I backed away, keeping our eyes on the shadows outside. but the whispers grew louder, angrier, like they were trying to force their way into our heads. Suddenly, Jason let out a strangled gasp. He pointed to the door, his hand shaking violently. I turned and saw it, a figure standing just beyond the threshold. At first, I thought it was a man, but the proportions were wrong. Its limbs were too long, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The thing was impossibly thin, its outline flickering like static on an old TV. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on us, even though it had no face. Jason grabbed the Ouija board, his hands trembling. What do we do? The figure stepped forward, one long, spindly leg crossing the threshold. Break it, I said, my voice hoarse. The board. Destroy it. Jason hesitated. What if it makes things worse? The figure stepped fully into the house. Its body shimmered and shifted, as though it wasn't entirely solid. The whispers grew deafening, drilling into my skull. Jason, I screamed. Do it now. He didn't need any more convincing. Jason grabbed the board and slammed it against the edge of the table, snapping it in half. The planchette clattered to the floor, spinning like a top before stopping dead. For a moment, everything went silent. The figure froze, its flickering form trembling. Then, with an ear-splitting screech, it collapsed in on itself, vanishing in a burst of shadow and static. The whispers stopped. The footsteps upstairs stopped. The candles stopped flickering. Jason and I stood there, panting and shaking, staring at the broken board on the floor. Did it work? Jason whispered. Before I could answer, the remaining candle blew out, plunging the room into darkness. And then, from somewhere in the pitch black, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." The room was suffocatingly dark. Jason scrambled for his phone, fumbling with it until the weak glow of its flashlight lit the room. The shattered Ouija board lay on the floor, but the pieces were vibrating, rattling softly as if they were alive. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The voice, low, menacing, and impossibly close, still echoed in my ears. "You shouldn't have done that." Suddenly, the rattling of the Ouija board stopped. The room went eerily still, like the world was holding its breath. "Maybe it's over," Jason muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. I was about to agree, desperate to cling to some semblance of hope, when the sound of heavy breathing filled the room. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs, but the flashlight revealed nothing, just the shadowy corners of the room, stretching endlessly under the dim light. And then the breathing stopped. Jason turned to me, his face pale as a ghost. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. My brain was screaming at me to get out of the house, but my legs refused to move. Then, the pieces of the Ouija board began to shift again, sliding slowly across the floor as if an invisible hand were dragging them. "Dude, do you see that?" Jason whispered, taking a step back. The two halves of the board came together, aligning perfectly despite the jagged break. The air grew colder, and my breath misted in front of me. Jason's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then the letters on the board began to burn, not with flames, but with an eerie, greenish light. It spelled, T-E-Y-A-R-E-H-E-R-E. Jason and I locked eyes. Before either of us could react, the planchette shot across the room like it had been thrown, slamming into the wall with enough force to splinter. "We need to leave," I shouted, grabbing Jason's arm. But before we could take a single step, the whispers returned. They weren't coming from the door this time. They were coming from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. All of them seemed to vibrate with overlapping voices, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Jason dropped his flashlight, and it clattered to the ground, the beam rolling wildly. "What do they want?" I didn't answer, couldn't. My eyes were fixed on the shadows in the corners of the room. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were moving. Tall, twisting forms began to emerge from the darkness, their bodies shifting and writhing like smoke. They had no faces, no features, just void-like outlines that pulsed with a sickly, greenish glow. One by one, they stepped closer. Jason grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor, holding it out like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. But the figures didn't stop. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Jason's phone and pointed its flashlight at the nearest shadow. The beam hit it, and for a split second, it recoiled, shrinking back into the darkness. "Light," I yelled. "They don't like the light." Jason scrambled to grab his phone, and we both started shining the beams around the room, forcing the shadows back. But there were too many of them, and the light was too weak. "We can't hold them off forever," Jason panted. The figures pressed closer, their distorted forms filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, until one voice broke through the noise. "You opened the door." The words were clear, sharp, and full of accusation. Jason stumbled back, his phone shaking in his hand. "We didn't mean to. We didn't." The shadows surged forward, their forms stretching unnaturally toward us. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and my skin burned like ice. I grabbed Jason and made a break for the door. We sprinted through the hallway, the shadows chasing us, their whispers echoing in our ears. When we reached the front door, it slammed shut in our faces, the lock clicking on its own. "No, no, no," Jason shouted, fumbling with the doorknob. I turned, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, and saw the shadows closing in. They filled the hallway, twisting and writhing, their greenish glow casting eerie patterns on the walls. And then I remembered the candles. "Jason," I shouted, "the candles! We need fire." He spun around, understanding dawning in his wide eyes. We bolted back to the living room, where the half-burned candles still sat on the table. The shadows swirled around us, their icy presence making it hard to breathe. Jason grabbed a candle and frantically struck a match. The moment the flame ignited, the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. I grabbed another match, lighting a second candle. The shadows shrank back further, their forms writhing as if in pain. But they didn't disappear. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice shaking. "We have to get out." Jason nodded, holding the candle like a lifeline. Together, we edged toward the door, the flames keeping the shadows at bay. When we reached the front door, Jason shoved the candle into my hand and threw his shoulder against the door. It gave way with a loud crack, and we stumbled out into the cold night air. The whispers stopped. The shadows didn't follow. For a moment, we just stood there, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Jason turned to me, his face pale and haunted. "What do we do now?" I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Jason's house stood like a dark, brooding presence behind us. We didn't speak, didn't move. The quiet felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. "What now?" Jason repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. My brain was still scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The flickering candle in my hand cast shaky shadows across the porch, and every creak of the wooden boards made me flinch. Maybe it's gone," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. Jason scoffed, his face twisted with disbelief. "Gone? Did you see what was in there? That thing said we opened a door. How do you close a door you can't even see?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He was right. Whatever we had invited in wasn't bound by walls or locks. It was still here, lingering, waiting. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the silence. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped the candle. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Did you think you could run?" I showed the screen to Jason, my hands trembling. His face went as white as a sheet. Another text came through. This one included a photo. It was of us, standing on the porch. Right now. Jason spun around, his flashlight slicing through the dark yard. But there was nothing there. Just the empty street, the barren trees, and the cold wind rustling through the leaves. "Who's out there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The response came, but not from the shadows outside. came from inside the house. A laugh, low, guttural, and echoing, like it was coming from every corner at once. Jason and I locked eyes, panic setting in. "We can't stay here," I said, grabbing his arm. "Let's go." He didn't argue. We ran to my car, the gravel crunching under our feet. Jason climbed into the passenger seat, clutching the candle like a lifeline. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door of Jason's house was wide open, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was the same shadowy form we had seen earlier, its body flickering like static. But now it wasn't alone. More shapes stood behind it, tall and twisted, their glowing outlines pulsing like diseased veins. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my heart hammering in my chest. "They're watching us," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the road. The drive was tense and silent, the only sounds the hum of the engine and our ragged breathing. I didn't stop until we were miles away, pulling into the empty lot of a 24-hour diner. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had happened pressing down on us. "Do you think it's over?" Jason finally asked. I didn't want to answer, because deep down I knew it wasn't. The text came through as if to confirm it. Another unknown number. This time it simply read, "The door is still open." Jason's phone buzzed next. He stared at the screen, his face pale. "It's my address," he whispered. My stomach dropped. "They're pulling us back," I said, my voice shaking. Jason shook his head violently. "No, I'm not going back there. I can't." "We don't have a choice," I said, though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to leave, to disappear and never look back. But that wasn't an option anymore. Not with whatever this was attached to us. Jason clenched his jaw, his hands trembling as he shoved his phone into his pocket. "If we go back, we're dead." "Maybe," I said, starting the car again. "But if we don't, I think it'll be worse." The drive back to Jason's house felt like stepping into a nightmare. The streetlights seemed dimmer, the air heavier, the world quieter. When we pulled into his driveway, the house loomed like a shadowy monolith. The front door was still open. The flickering forms were gone, but I could feel them, their presence pressing against my skin like static electricity. We got out of the car, candles still in hand. The wind whipped around us, extinguishing Jason's flame. He cursed, frantically striking a match to relight it. "We get in, figure out how to close this and get out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Jason nodded, though his hands were trembling so hard he could barely hold the match. As we stepped onto the porch, the floorboards groaned beneath our weight. The air inside the house was freezing, and every breath misted in front of us. The Ouija board was gone. In its place was a mirror. It hung on the wall above the coffee table, its surface cracked and warped, reflecting the room in strange, distorted angles. "We didn't put that there," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "No kidding," I muttered. The mirror seemed to pulse with a faint, greenish glow, and as we stepped closer, words began to appear on its surface, written in what looked like frost. "Ask your final question." Jason turned to me, his eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer, but as I stared into the mirror, something moved in its reflection. It wasn't us. It was them. The mirror shimmered, its cracked surface twisting the room into an unrecognizable nightmare. Jason and I stood frozen, staring at the distorted figures shifting within the glass. They were closer now, their twisted, flickering shapes almost brushing the surface. "Ask your final question." The words etched into the frost seemed to pulse, demanding an answer. "I'm not doing this," Jason whispered, shaking his head violently. "No way. This is insane. You think we have a choice?" I snapped, my voice trembling. "If we don't play by their rules, they'll make the choice for us." Jason's eyes darted to the mirror, his face pale and drenched in sweat. What do we even ask?" The figures in the mirror were no longer just watching. They were pressing against the glass, their distorted bodies bulging like they were trying to force their way through. I took a shaky step closer to the mirror. We need to know how to stop this. How to close the door. Jason grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. What if asking makes it worse? What if? Before he could finish, the air in the room shifted. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch and slither toward us, their movements slow but deliberate. Jason, I said, pulling free from his grip. We don't have time for what if. I stepped closer to the mirror, my reflection barely visible through the warped surface. My throat was dry, and my voice cracked as I spoke. How do we close the door? The room fell deathly silent. Even the hum stopped, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. The frost on the mirror melted away, replaced by new words that etched themselves into the glass like a sinister hand was writing them. The door requires a soul. What does that mean? Jason whispered, his voice rising in panic. But I already knew. My stomach dropped, and my legs felt weak. It was a trade, an offering. No, Jason said, shaking his head. No, there's no way. I'm not. A deafening crack cut him off as the mirror split down the middle, the glass bending outward like it was being pushed from the other side. And then they came through. The figures poured out of the mirror, their bodies flickering and shifting like smoke. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They surrounded us, circling like predators. Jason screamed, swinging his candle wildly, but the shadows didn't flinch. They closed in, their forms pressing against us, cold and suffocating. One of them leaned close to me, its featureless face inches from mine. Choose, it whispered, the word crawling into my ears like ice. I turned to Jason, my mind racing. We don't have a choice, Jason. It's one of us or it's both of us. His face twisted in horror. No, we can figure something else out. We can. But his words were drowned out as the figures began to press against him, their cold tendrils wrapping around his arms and legs. He thrashed and screamed, but it was no use. They were dragging him toward the mirror. Help me, he screamed, his voice raw with terror. I froze, paralyzed by fear and indecision. The shadows were all around us, their whispers deafening, their intent clear. Jason, I shouted, my voice breaking. The mirror pulsed with light, the glass rippling like water. The shadows held Jason in place, forcing him to look into its surface. His reflection twisted and contorted, his face filled with terror. And then, without warning, the mirror spoke. One must stay. Jason's eyes locked onto mine, tears streaming down his face. Don't let them take me, he begged. Please. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the pressure unbearable. The mirror pulsed again, and I knew I had to make a decision. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Jason's eyes widened in shock. No, don't you dare. Before he could finish, I lunged forward and pushed him away from the mirror. The shadows recoiled, their grip on him breaking as they turned their attention to me. The cold enveloped me instantly, the whispers piercing my mind. The last thing I saw was Jason's horrified face as he scrambled toward the door. Run, I managed to choke out. Close the door behind you. And then the shadows dragged me into the mirror. I don't remember much after that. Just darkness, cold, whispers that never stopped. But somehow I'm still here. Jason never spoke to me again after that night, and I don't blame him. He boarded up the house and moved far away, trying to leave the nightmare behind. But the thing about doors, they're never really closed. It's been 6 months since that night, and I don't know how I'm still alive. I woke up 3 days after the shadows dragged me into the mirror. Not in Jason's house, not even in a hospital, but lying on the side of a road in the middle of nowhere. My clothes were torn, my body bruised, and my head pounding. The only thing in my pocket was a shard of the mirror, jagged and cold, wrapped in an old piece of paper with 3 words scrawled on it. It isn't over. Since then, things haven't been the same. First, I thought I'd escaped. I told myself I was free, that whatever had happened in that house had been left behind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The signs started small. A shadow darting in the corner of my vision. My reflection lingering a split second too long in the mirror. Whispers in the dead of night when I knew I was alone. Then it got worse. Doors in my apartment would slam on their own. Objects would move, just slightly, as though nudged by an unseen hand. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the lights flickering, the air so cold I could see my breath, and the mirror shard. It started to glow. The greenish light would pulse faintly, growing stronger whenever I felt the presence around me. I tried to get rid of it, threw it in the trash, buried it in the woods, even tossed it in a river. But no matter what I did, it always came back. Always. Jason called me once, weeks after that night. I didn't even know he had my number. He didn't say much, just whispered 3 words before hanging up. They found me. I tried calling him back, but his number was disconnected. A week later, I saw his name in the news. A house fire. No survivors. I knew better than to believe it was an accident. The whispers grew louder after that, more insistent. I started hearing my name in them, low and guttural, like a predator calling its prey. One night, I woke up to find the shard glowing brighter than ever, filling the room with an eerie green light. My reflection stared back at me from its surface. Not just my face, but my whole body, standing in an empty void. And then it moved. My reflection tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that I hadn't made. Its lips curled into a grin. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The shard grew cold in my hand, the frost spreading across its surface. Words began to etch themselves into the glass, just like they had on the mirror in Jason's house. The door remains open. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers became deafening. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows poured out of the shard, writhing and twisting, filling the air with their cold, suffocating presence. They surrounded me, their forms flickering like static, their voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. "You brought us here," they hissed. "You opened the door. Now you must keep it closed." I didn't understand what they meant. I still don't. But the shadows didn't give me a choice. The shard burned in my hand, and for a split second, I felt like I was falling. Then everything went silent. When I woke up, the shard was gone, but the whispers remained. Now, every mirror I see shows glimpses of that night. Jason's house, the figures in the glass, the moment the shadows took me. They're always watching, always waiting. I've moved 3 times, but it doesn't matter. They follow me wherever I go. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Jason's voice in the whispers. I don't know if it's really him or just another trick, but it doesn't matter. The shadows don't want me dead. They want me to keep the door closed. And so I do. I've learned how to quiet the whispers, how to push the shadows back when they get too close. But it's not enough. The door remains open, and every day, I feel it pulling at me, drawing me closer. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. So if you're reading this, let me give you one piece of advice. If you ever find a Ouija board, no matter how curious you are, no matter how harmless it seems, don't touch it. Because once you open the door, it never really closes.